Okay, so with that kind of overarching broad concept, my view of the world, let's move on to some basic concepts again. So for mechanisms of cell injury, there are so many different ways that tissues can be injured. One, and probably one of the more common, is hypoxia, or lack of an oxygen supply. That clearly is going to cause problems because we're not going to be able to make ATP very efficiently. And if you don't make adenosine triphosphate, you're not going to be able to power the cells and the tissues and everything else. So you will lose function. Infection is clearly a way that we can have injury. So we'll talk about pathogen-host interactions because infection is a very important kind of general mechanism of cell injury. Trauma, clearly. I will walk out of the studio today and step in front of a bus. No, I won't. But I mean, that's trauma. I could get burned. I could get zapped, electrocuted. I could have any variety of freezing or thawing or whatever. And that trauma will cause physical chemical injury to me. There's genetic injury. So mutations or variations in the genetic code can lead to defective responses or to actual failure of certain functions. The immune system. So the immune system in general is going to be our protection against infection, but the immune system can also be a source of injury. And as we will see when we talk about acute and chronic inflammation, for example, there are a bunch of mediators that are made that can cause a world of damage as kind of innocent bystander damage. So the immune system is potentially a very useful thing, but in autoimmune disease and even in standard run-of-the-mill inflammation can be a source of cell injury. You can have nutritional injury. You can have too much or too little. You can have too many vitamins or too much of a vitamin or too little. So nutrition is another way for cell injury to occur. Clearly senescence, aging, the accumulation of 1,000 little paper cuts to our genetic material and to the cells will lead to overall injury. And then chemical injury, the toxins that we encounter, or the things like too much glucose or too much oxygen. Okay, so those are the etiologies for cell injury. Let's talk about the basic cellular components that are susceptible to injury. So when we get hit or when we traumatized, when we get ischemic, when we are exposed to a toxin, what are the cellular components that are susceptible? And cell injury will lead to loss of protein synthetic capacity. As I said before, we're constantly turning over. But if we're not, because of some form of cell injury, that process of renewal will very quickly lead to degeneration and death. Membrane structure. So membranes, plasma membranes around every cell need to have integrity in order to preserve all the activities that are going on inside the cell. If the membrane gets perturbed for any of a variety of reasons, we're in trouble. And it's not just the plasma membrane, but it's the membranes of all the organelles. Lysosomal membranes, mitochondrial membranes, nuclear membranes. ATP generation, clearly. If we're not making ATP, we're out of luck. And so maintaining that is important, and cell injury will definitely recurrently hit our ability to generate ATP, and we'll talk about why that causes ultimately cell death in greater detail. And then genetic integrity. If we don't protect the genome, we have no way of renewing everything else. Everything's run at the level of the nucleus, and we need to have the nuclear material intact and in the appropriate sequence without mutations, or we're in trouble. So the cell injury can inhibit all of these or affect all of these. And again, response to injury, you adapt or you die. And that adaptation may be that you get more cells, or you get bigger cells, or you get smaller cells. There are a variety of ways that we can adapt. As a response to injury, you may actually have loss of function. The cells may not be dead, but they may not be doing their job. So for example, if I cut off the blood supply to a portion of your heart, within about a minute, you've lost the ATP necessary to get contraction. Those cardiac myocytes, however, are still alive for the next 30 minutes. So we will lose function, and then hopefully we will intervene with a clot buster or something and get blood supply back in before the heart dies. So one of the responses to injury is loss of function. Clearly, if you don't adapt, and after you have loss of function, you'll get cell death and tissue breakdown. And when we get to that cell injury thing, we will be talking about two major flavors. One is necrosis, which you can think of as cellular homicide. Something happened to a cell and killed it. And then there's apoptosis, which is a form of programmed cell death, whereby the cell quietly commits suicide, apoptosis. So you have cellular homicide, necrosis, cellular suicide, apoptosis. Once you have cell death, you'll have acute and chronic inflammation. And those forms of inflammation are going to be very important to understand. We'll get into some incredible detail about that because there are a number of therapeutic interventions that we can use to impact that. And then once we've had cell death and acute and chronic inflammation have come in, the options for the tissue are that we regenerate or we make a scar. And in most cases, it's neither one or the other, it's some combination of both. And we'll talk much more about that. And then finally, there's malignancy. So this is a response to injury. Yes, it is. It is because of inflammation or genetic injury or toxins or something like that, that we develop mutations that allow for expansion of a tumor. But it's really important, and we will spend probably 4 different topic discussions or more talking about malignancy, and it's not just proliferation. Malignancy is so much more than just uncontrolled cell growth. Okay, and with that, we have come to the end of the basic conceptual framework for all of pathology. And if you just keep those in mind, as I said, all the rest are just details.